If you've ever taken the Woolwich Ferry, you might have noticed this building here either getting on or getting off. This is North Woolwich Station, or rather it was. It's currently abandoned, but it used to be the terminus of a railway that never quite lived up to the hopes of its builders. Actually, few lines have been quite as messed around by fate as this one. This is the story of the North Woolwich Railway. In 1842, a railway company called the Eastern Counties and Thames Junction Railway was formed. This was intended to provide a link between the Eastern Counties Railway at Stratford and the river at North Woolwich. In 1846, the first section was completed from Stratford to Barking Road, and the following year the bit from Barking Road to North Woolwich was completed. That same year the company was purchased by the Eastern Counties Railway. This was pretty standard practice with railways. Form a company to get the thing built, then a bigger company takes it over. There wasn't really anything at North Woolwich at the time, but that wasn't the point. If you're not familiar with the geography of London, Woolwich is split in two by the River Thames. In the southern part was the Royal Arsenal, an absolutely huge complex of factories that supplied armaments to the British Armed Forces, and given the size of the British Empire in the mid-19th century, that was a lot of armaments. At its peak, the arsenal provided employment for something in the region of 80,000 people, and its lands stretched as far as what is now Thamesmead. They also had their own football team, but that's not important right now. What is important is that it was potentially a huge source of traffic for an enterprising railway company, and it had no railway serving it. The Eastern Counties Railway planned to run their trains to North Woolwich and then operate a ferry across the Thames. Coincidentally, the company operating the Woolwich Ferry had closed down in 1844, leaving a gap in the market. The Eastern Counties provided extra luxurious carriages on their trains as a further attraction for any passengers put off by the prospect of a river crossing. It was a fantastic scheme, for about 2 years. Then, in 1849, the South Eastern Railway opened a station right next to the Woolwich Arsenal and swiped a huge chunk of the Eastern Counties traffic away. North Woolwich was starting to see some development of its own, but it was still a blow to the line. Before we go any further, and the next twist of fate to hit the North Woolwich line, let's take a look at the route. The northern section began at Stratford, then headed down, stopping along the way at Stratford Bridge, which is now Stratford High Street. The next station was Barking Road, which would later be renamed Canning Town. Then it headed south, roughly paralleling the river. Is paralleling a word? Well, it is now. Finally, it would terminate at North Woolwich. The original North Woolwich station was a wooden building, roughly where the turntable was, which you can clearly see on Google Earth. The more substantial building that survives today dates from 1854. The old railway pier is also still there, just about. It's hidden behind a wall, but if you go down this slightly creepy footpath, you can get a better view. So now I've given you an idea of the route the railway took, I'm going to explain how it was completely rerouted. In 1855, the Royal Victoria Dock was opened. This was an enormous structure designed to cope with the ever-increasing shipping coming into London. Unfortunately, the entrance to the docks had to cut straight through the railway. A swing bridge was built, but this really wasn't a great solution for either the frequent train service or the busy dock. Therefore, the whole railway line was rerouted north. A new station was opened at Custom House. The old route became known as the Woolwich Abandoned Line, but later found a new lease of life as the Silvertown Tramway. I've done a whole separate video on that, which I'll link down below. In 1858, another station was opened, called Tidal Basin. This was very slightly west of the present Royal Victoria Station. This map has it listed as Tidal Basin Urinal Station, which I can't imagine helped matters. And in 1863, Silvertown Station was opened. Silvertown hadn't existed in the 1840s. It was an area that built up around the works of a firm called S.W. Silver. Meanwhile, in 1862, the Eastern Counties Railway became the largest constituent of the Great Eastern Railway. Then, in the 1870s, more bad news. The Royal Albert Dock was to be built, and once again the railway would get a ruddy great dock cutting through it. So they constructed a tunnel, the Connaught Tunnel, which opened in 1878. The old line once again survived, but under the care of the Dock Company. However, in emergencies, the Great Eastern were allowed to run trains over the new swing bridge. Just after the junction for the tunnel, there was a line owned by the Dock Company which ran to Galleon's Reach. This fed traffic onto the North Woolwich line. I could do an entire video on that if you like, but for now, I'm just going to mention that there was a station here at Connaught Road, just after the junction for the tunnel, under the hotel here. Sic transit gloria mundi. Even more bad news in 1889. That year, the London County Council began operating a free ferry across the river, very near to the railway pier. As free was considerably cheaper than the Great Eastern Railway's fares, most passengers chose to take that instead. Nevertheless, the Great Eastern continued to operate their ferry until 1908. They kept their pier on the North Bank, though, even after ending the service. They instead used it to provide a steamer service to Southend and Margate. Still, by this time the line was pretty well served. The Great Eastern Railway had an extensive network of suburban railways running to places like Fenchurch Street, Stoke Newington, Bethnal Green and Alexandra Palace. All of these connected with the North Woolwich line. In 1923 the Great Eastern Railway became part of the London and North Eastern Railway. All the railways on the British mainland at this time were grouped into 4 companies, and the London and North Eastern took most of the eastern side of the country north of London. But it had also taken over some of the poorest companies, which did not bode well for the security of underperforming lines. During the Second World War, passenger services were reduced. In 1940, passenger trains along the Galleons branch ended. The docks were a major target for German bombing raids. Custom House and North Woolwich would both be hit on the 7th of September 1940. In 1941, bomb damage closed Tidal Basin. When it was reopened, it was so little used that they closed it again, this time for good, in 1943. With competition from buses and lorries, traffic on the line continued to dwindle after the war. In 1948, another takeover, as the London and North Eastern Railway became part of British Railways, which in turn would be rebranded as British Rail in 1965. In 1970, the Port of London Authority's railways closed. So ended the last freight services over the line. The passenger service limped on. In 1979, for the first time in over a century, something good happened to the line. The Greater London Council and British Rail decided to connect the North Woolwich line to the North London line at Stratford. Passenger services between Stratford and Dalston had been withdrawn in 1943, and the North London line in general was in a financially precarious position. By reinstating the service and connecting with the North Woolwich line, it was hoped to provide a shot in the arm to all concerned. The stations were rebuilt, a connection with the District line was built at West Ham, and the route was electrified. Although the fact that the line between Custom House and North Woolwich was reduced to single track suggests that no one was expecting great things of the revitalised railway. The substantial old station building at Woolwich was turned into a railway museum in 1984. Meanwhile, plans were afoot elsewhere. In 1994, the Docklands Light Railway opened an extension to Beckton, which ran alongside the North Woolwich line to a point just beyond Custom House, and continued along the route of the old Galleons branch. It had its own station at Custom House, effectively recreated the old Tidal Basin station at Royal Victoria, and added some extra stops of its own. Then, in 2005, another DLR branch opened to King George V, the dock, not the monarch. This ran along the south side of the Royal Docks, ironically using the route that had been abandoned back in the 1850s. The station at King George V was a short distance from North Woolwich, and the new station at London City Airport was similarly close to Silvertown. As the DLR could now provide a better service to just about every stop on the North Woolwich line from Custom House to its terminus, that whole section was closed in 2006. In 2009, the DLR extended to Woolwich Arsenal, succeeding where the Eastern Counties Railway never could. In 2011, the DLR would just straight up take over the North Woolwich's section from Canning Town to Stratford, killing the North Woolwich line once and for all. But it doesn't even end there. No sooner had closure of the Custom House to North Woolwich section been announced than a proposal was put forward to turn it into a heritage railway. This would have added 2 new stations, Connaught and Albert Road, and reinstated the double track. Unlike other heritage railways, it would have been electrified, enabling preserved electric trains to use it and for mainline companies to train their staff on it during the week. The scheme was approved in 2007, but as you've no doubt figured out, fate only ever gave the North Woolwich line hope in order to dash it. And that's what happened here. In 2008, Crossrail was authorised. One of its branches would run out to Abbey Wood, passing through the Docklands, and en route it would absorb nearly the entire Custom House to North Woolwich section. So, no heritage railway. Still, with Crossrail being such a huge and prestigious project, maybe the North Woolwich line will finally get some positive recognition. Or maybe not. These days, of course, the old station is still very visible, though the museum closed in 2008. In view of the many surviving original features, it's Grade 2 listed. In 2021 it was bought by the New Covenant Church, although it's not clear what they plan to do with it. Well, this video was rather longer than usual. It turns out there was a lot more to the North Woolwich line than I thought. I do hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please click the like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already. I was going to talk a lot more about the Woolwich Ferry in this video, but I decided to spin it off into its own separate thing, so keep an eye out for that. Thanks as ever to my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon. You are basically the opposite of all the terrible things that happen to the North Woolwich line. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.